We're in Acts 12. But we also noticed or noted last week when we were looking at this that about this famine, that it's well documented in secular history also. So for right at this time frame. So let's review where we were. Acts 12. We got through the first 6 verses of Acts 12. Go to the first slide there. So again, we see where Antioch is, where we left off. Peter is down in Jerusalem. They had sent the prophet up to Antioch. They learned about that. So Peter and, Paul and Barnabas have been sent with the funds back down to Jerusalem. And that's where we're at now. So Peter's down in Jerusalem also. So go ahead to the next slide. So here's where we went through some of this. So a lot of this is review this first 5 verses. So I'll go through this pretty quick, these first 5 verses. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some of the church. I mentioned last week, this is Herod Agrippa I. The Herods were horrible people. We discussed this last week. This Herod Agrippa I that's talked about here is the grandson of Herod the Great, who was the first Herod. And he's the great baby killer of Bethlehem. And when he heard there was a Messiah going to be born from the wise men, and he heard the rumors that came from the wise men, he sent assassins up to go root out all the babies in Bethlehem and have them all killed. He also he had 5 wives, and one of them was particularly beautiful. She was of the Hasmonean line, and they were like heroes in Jerusalem. I mentioned this last week. Her dad, or his father-in-law, was more he sensed that he was more popular than Herod, and so he had him killed. He had his 3 sons killed because they were more popular, and then he finally had her killed because of course she didn't have anything to do with him after that, so he had her executed also. So real nice guy. Herod Antipas was his uncle, and he's the one that had John the Baptist beheaded, another wicked. So these Herods were horrible people. And we mentioned that in Agrippa's case, the one we're talking about here, Herod Agrippa, he was jealous for the affection of the people. He wanted to be adored by the masses. He wanted to be a real celebrity. And secular history agrees with that. We talked about that last week also. And the famine, we also mentioned last week, it was kind of an opportunity for Herod to show himself or present himself as the benevolent leader, provider. He was able to arrange to have goods shipped in from other countries, grains and things like that. And so now he's got a new plan here. We see in verse 1, what better way to gain favor with the Jews in Jerusalem than to oppress and persecute Christians, to harass Christians. So we see in verse 1 of chapter 12, that's exactly what he's up to here. Stretched out his hand against the church. So verse 2, we see he killed James, the brother of John. And I mentioned this, there was 3 James. This is, it says right here, this is John's brother, James, one of the sons of Zebedee. So James is the, first apostle of the 12 apostles to become a martyr, to be killed just because of his association with Christ. And his brother John would be the last to die of natural causes. So, but James was the first to be killed, to be martyred, first apostle, I should say, because we saw Stephen already murdered for his witness for Christ. Stephen was a deacon. Okay, verse 3. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. So James and Peter, kind of like co-pastors in Jerusalem here. And Agrippa's going right for the leadership of the church. He's lining himself up in opposition of Christ and his church here, and never a good place to be. He saw how effective it was with the Jews. You know, they liked the fact that he killed James, and so he's going to plan to do the same thing to Peter here. He's going to have Peter beheaded, just like he did James, and he's going to make it a public show, so he can get even more praise from the Jews. But then somebody reminds him, oh, you can't do it during the days of unleavened bread. That leads right up to the Passover. And during that week, Jewish Holy Week, you know, you can't offend them, so you can't be axing off people's heads during that period. So, verse 4, so when he had arrested him, he put him in prison, and then he delivered him 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after the Passover. So he was going to bring him and do a public execution. That's his clear intent here. 4 squads. It says here, delivered him 4 squads of soldiers. This is there's 4 per shift, so there's 16. There's 2 chained. We're going to see later, directly to Peter, 1 to each arm, and then there's 2 out directly outside, and then 2 more. So. Or excuse me, just 2 outside. So that's 4 per shift. Kind of overkill for just this one Christian, a security overkill, but they were serious. It was serious business here. And they'd seen Christians elude them many times beforehand, going all the way back to Jesus when they tried to seize him so many times. So verse 5, Peter was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. So the saints interceding on behalf of one of their loved ones, it's a very powerful thing. We've seen it in this church as well. I'm not going to go into as much comment on that as I did last week. But this is where we left off. We're going to see, we don't know exactly specifically what they were praying for. Like, for example, were they just praying for strength so that he would die? Like Stephen did, praising his God right to his death. We're going to see here that they had no expectation of his release. But were they praying for that? I don't know. If they were, they didn't believe it was going to happen. But we don't know exactly. They were just praying, it says. So verse 6, this is where we left off. And Herod was about to bring them out. So this is the night, maybe early morning. This next morning, Herod was going to bring him out, but Peter was in there sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers, so as I mentioned, and the guards before the door were keeping the prison. So there was 2 outside, 2 chained to him. And he's facing public execution the next morning, and everybody knows it. And what was he doing? Sawing logs. He's sleeping like a baby. You see what kind of peace the Prince of Peace can bring you? Here he is, a condemned prisoner, facing execution, like James just happened before him, yet here he is sleeping soundly, not worried. And the guards have got to be thinking, does this guy know something we don't know? Yeah, he kind of does. Psalm 4:8 says this, I will both lie down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell safely. So when you're troubled a bit, when you try to sleep, anxious about something, and just if you're in unrest, you can take the Psalm 4:8 formula. Just quote that verse. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. For you alone, Lord, make me dwell safely. That's how we can have sweet rest and in Jesus. Rest in Jesus is sweet rest. But he's bound between the two. Okay, that's a well-documented practice of the Romans. The prisoner would be chained to 2 guards. But okay, verse 7. Now behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone around in the prison, and he struck Peter. This is the angel. He struck Peter on the side to get him awake and raise him up, saying, arise quickly. And his chains fell off his hands. As soon as he started to stand up, they just fell off. And a light shone. Now, this light has no source. It's not a torch or some sort of lamp or something like this. This is a light with a supernatural source, not a natural one. I read in some commentators say things like, some lightning flash. No, it doesn't say there was a flash of light. It says a light shone. And it's a light it's the light of the world that needs no source other than God himself. And so notice the angel has to strike him to wake him up. He was really zonked out. And verse 8 says, then the angel said to him, gird yourself and tie on your sandals. And so he did. And he said to him, put on your garment and follow me. And so he went out and followed him, and he did not know what was done. He did not know that what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. So he was really zonked out, and he might be thinking he's dreaming here. Can this be real? And he's at this point, he's still wondering. Now, we're not told what the guards experienced here. Are they just dazed? Or do they only see and hear what God directs them to see and hear? Remember, sometimes they all bull rushed Jesus to take him, and it says he just walked through them, and then they stood there and they got clubs and everything, and they were confused. They didn't even know why they had the clubs, and Jesus isn't even there anymore. He just kind of walked right through them. So he can make them see and hear whatever he chooses to make their brains perceive. And perhaps all they saw and heard was Peter snoring there. And so anyway, verse 10. When they were past the first and second guard posts, so they had a lot of security here, then they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them on its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So as soon as he's clear of danger, the angel disappears. And then when Peter had come to himself, he said, now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people. The expectation of the Jewish people. You know what that was? That Peter be killed. And Peter knew it too. And that's why he says that, from the expectation of the Jewish people. Verse 12. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary. So he's pondering this. Wow, what had just happened. He came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. This is an all-night prayer vigil, apparently. They're gathered together. And the early Christians in Jerusalem, which is where they're at here, were at first able to gather and have their church meetings and prayer meetings within the synagogues and the temple. But that was only for a short period of time. Remember, right after Stephen came and he was murdered, there was persecution arose in Jerusalem. And so they began to meet in homes. and they had no fancy cathedrals, and they didn't wear any fancy costumes or fish head hats. But it wasn't until almost 400 years later that under Constantine, when he legalized Christianity, that he actually had sanctioned some churches to be built. He actually funded the building of churches. Well, that's when it started in the 400s. So until then, 400 years of churches just meeting in homes or outside. And it's still the case today. In many countries, this is where Christian meetings happen. This is where they gather together in his name. It's in homes, in basements, wherever they can do it, free from oppression. This is where it's done. So we see here John, whose surname was Mark. We'll hear more about him going forward in this study. This is the author of the Gospel, Mark. And we see from Colossians 4:10 that Mark was Barnabas's cousin. And so that makes this Mary here, Mark's mom, that makes her Barnabas's aunt, right? So he's a young guy here. Some say late teens, early 20s. So he's young. All right, verse 13. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. I mean, this news had to get back to all these people in there praying right there. And she was so excited, she didn't even open the gate. She just ran in. Now, she knew Peter. She knew him well. She'd heard him preach and all the stuff there in Jerusalem. This would be kind of like her pastor there. And they said to her, look at verse 15, "You are beside yourself." Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, well, it's his angel. It's his angel here. We talked about this a little bit at the men's meeting yesterday. The rabbis believed that they believed in guardian angels, and they actually believed that the guardian angel bore a resemblance of the person that they're guarding. So they're saying, well, that's why he kind of looks like him. So this carries over. This is sort of belief in the guardian angel things. Now, I'm not saying there's not guardian angels. I'm just saying that probably not a specific angel that's assigned to you from your birth. We see over and over again that God refers to angels as his ministers, his messengers. God is omnipotent. He doesn't need one watching over you, because he's watching over everything simultaneously, everywhere. And when he needs to send an angel to your aid, he can pick from the bullpen at any time, and they don't need to be any closer than the next one. He doesn't need to have them assigned like that, I don't believe. But I wouldn't be upset to find out that maybe they do have assigned ones, but I doubt it. The Bible's very careful not to indicate his angel or her angel. This is the only place that we see this. We talked about this at the men's meeting yesterday, where we see them being quoted as saying his angel. But when the Bible talks about it's always his angel, it's God's angels, right? It's not Phil's angel or Brenda's angel. But Christians are watched over, and would-be Christians are watched over from birth. But that's by God, and the angels are there to do his bidding when and how he says so. Anyway, that's sort of an aside. So they say it's his angel. Verse 16. Now Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. So, I mean, they're astonished. The sheer unlikelihood of Peter being released, he's got this custodia, this 4 squads of soldiers watching him in 4 shifts. And they knew the determination of the Jews and of Herod to see his head removed, and they didn't expect to ever see him alive again. Verse 17. But motioning to them with his hands, Peter says, shh, keep it down. It's not safe here, really, for you to be creating a ruckus here. The word will get out that I'm here, and they'll come after you guys and everybody else. And so he says, look, keep it down here. And he told them what happened. He declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of prison, and he said, go tell all these things to James and to the brethren. So he wants all the Christians there in Jerusalem to know this, that he is not only alive, but don't be concerned when he disappears, because he's gonna leave town. So not safe here. This is the same as it is in many Muslim, Hindu countries and communist countries today. Many Christians, it's not safe for them. And so he leaves there, and now he's kind of a well-known wanted man. And so he departs and went to another place. It says here in verse 17. Now, the Papists, that's the Roman Catholic Church, say he went to Rome here because they make him Rome's first, they call him the first Pope, Peter. And but there's no secular evidence or biblical evidence for Peter ever being in Rome. But it's highly unlikely that he did go to Rome. And it's more likely that he simply went up to Antioch, where Christians were free and they were prosperous, and the church was thriving there. In Galatians 2:11, we see that Peter went to Antioch during this same time period, while Saul and Barnabas were both there. So I'm going to go with Antioch because it lines up better with what the Bible says over the Papist tradition. Go forward one slide. We'll jump back to this one. Here's Galatians 2:11 through 13. Now, when Peter had come to Antioch, I withstood him to his face, because he was to be blamed. For before certain men came from James, that's from the church down in Jerusalem, he would eat with the Gentiles, but when they came, he withdrew and separated himself, fearing those who were of the circumcision. And the rest of the Jews also played hypocrite with him, so that even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. So you see, Peter still got this old religious baggage that the old Peter, the old Simon Peter, and Paul lays the blame on him here. Remember, we talked about God had to show him that call no things common or unclean that I have cleansed. Call nothing that I have cleansed unclean or common. And here he is with these Christians, and he won't even eat with them. Unclean, common. And so Paul took him to task, rebuked him to his face, and he says there, Peter, because he was to blame. Peter was a leader in the church, and leaders got to be careful what they do. They followed his lead. Even Barnabas was carried away with their hypocrisy. And so the rest of them, he could have set a good precedent there, or a good example there, and instead, so Paul had to jump in and clear that up. But the point is, our Bibles show that Peter came up to Antioch during the same time, and he was there for a while because he was accustomed to eating with the Gentile Christians until some Jews from Jerusalem came up there. It says from James, but so he reverted to his old self. So jump back one slide. There you go. So verse 18. Then as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers about what had become of Peter. Well, as you might expect. Now, it appears that nobody knows exactly what happened here. Look at verse 19. When Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. Now remember where Caesarea is. It's about where Tel Aviv is today, a little north of there. It's a coastal city just north of Joppa. We had seen that earlier. That's where Cornelius was. Remember, it was a Roman city. It was kind of the headquarters of the Roman governor there, and we saw that in chapter 10, right on the shores of the Mediterranean. But anyway, so he goes back to there. He leaves Jerusalem and goes back to there. But we see in verse 19 that he had cross-examined the soldiers, the guards, and he's not buying we don't know what happened line. They didn't have any answers for him. And that had to really disturb, because they knew they were facing death. If you were a guard, and Roman guard, and your prisoner escaped, no matter what the circumstances were, they all knew they were going to be put to death. So you'd think they'd tell the truth, right? If they had taken bribes or there was some big scheme going on here, somebody would have spilled the beans out of those 16 men. But they all got executed. So this had to be impactful for Herod. And he goes back home a little frustrated here. So now we see kind of a little different from this point on until Acts maybe 15. We really don't hear from Peter anymore. He's low key. He's a wanted man. All right, verse 20. Now Herod had been very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. So these are coastal cities further up north from Caesarea, Tyre and Sidon. But they came to him with one accord, and having made Blastus the king's personal aide. Now, it's not too late to change Luke's name to Blastus, Cam. So that's a good name, Blastus. But anyway, Luke had been Herod had been very angry with people, sorry about that. But they came to him with one accord, having made Blastus, the king's personal aide, their friend. They asked for peace because their country was supplied with food by the king's country. So the famine had hit Tyre and Sidon also, even though they were merchant cities on the coast there. This is where a lot of the goods from the east would get on ships and head out, and supplies from Egypt and all those countries westward would come in through that direction also, through the Tyre and Sidon, great shipping seaport peoples. But it says here, because their country was supplied with food by the king's country, so he could somehow control what they actually got, and what those two cities got. We're not really told what the dispute was about, but we can assume it had to do with something to do with commerce, and the use of those seaports. And he was not happy with them. It says very angry. So they get this inside man here, this personal aide. His name's Blastus, and to set up this little show that we're going to see here of praise and honor, they're going to give him what he really wants. He wants the affection of the people, and so they kind of know, okay, all we got to do is butter him up, pretend like we love him, and so they set this up. So verse 21. On a set day, Herod, arrayed in royal apparel, sat on his throne and gave an oration to them. And the people kept shouting, "The voice of a God and not a man, the voice of a God and not a man." Well, this is the exact reception that Herod Agrippa always dreamed of, always wanted. He's finally won the praise, and all this crowd, they got this big showing here. And this is in one of their stadiums. It says here he's on his throne. It's not his throne. It's not even in his city area. It's not in Caesarea. It's up in Tyre and Sidon, and they got one of these, that the Romans always built, those Colosseum type things, right? And so he's got his little area that's elevated, of course, and has a little where his entourage can be. And he's being openly worshiped here by the people. So let's see what happens. Verse 23. Then immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give glory to God, and he was eaten by worms and died. So he accepted this praise and worship and did not give glory to God. And we don't see it said here, but he knew better. He knew better than to accept this praise, and he vainly accepted it. And let's jump one more slide down. One more. Yeah, this is from Josephus. He says it took 5 days. Let's go ahead and read it. He put on a garment. This is Agrippa, Herod Agrippa. He put on a garment made wholly of silver and a contexture truly wonderful, and came to the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner, and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. And presently his flatterers cried out, one from one place and one from another, though not for his good, that he was a god. A severe pain also arose in his belly and began in a most violent manner. And when he had been quite worn out by the pain in his belly for 5 days, he departed this life. So now Josephus, if you don't know who that is, that he's a Jewish historian, but he was a Roman. He was a Roman citizen. He lived in Rome, but the Romans relied on him for all things Jewish. He was the authority, and he had wrote volumes and volumes of books about all things Jewish. And he was not a believer, but you see here, he records it much like we see in our Bibles. So they all saw this, and it happened in real time. You see verse 23, it says, then immediately. So you can jump back one. Yeah. It says, then immediately. So Herod Agrippa never makes it back to Jerusalem to do any more oppression or persecution of Christians. And everyone is well aware, and this spreads quickly, everyone is well aware of the circumstances surrounding his death. And notice the reason in verse 23 that's given for this immediate judgment. And this is how we really like to see judgment happen from God, right? Right when it's coming out of their mouth, they get struck. But it doesn't happen in our timetable, but it happens. God, the hammer's already coming down on these people, these people that are God deniers and these opponents of his church, like the Herods, all of them. The hammer's swinging. It's already coming down. It just won't happen. We might not see it, on our timetable. It says, because he did not give glory to God. That's the reason given. That's why it makes me think back in verse 19 where it says he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. I think he had an idea that there was divine intervention here that was what it was to blame for Peter's release and not those poor guards. So he decided, instead of accepting that and saying, well, okay, no, he had all those guards put to death anyway, even though they had nothing to do with it. And one of the reasons might be that he didn't want the account of what happened from their standpoint to get out. So he has them all killed. So he's further trying to oppose God. But just like his grandfather, he knew better. Go back down to that other slide. I don't know if I mentioned that at the bottom there. Josephus also records that this same horrible way to go took his grandfather, Herod the Great. So he was his grandfather, and that's also recorded by Josephus. So they both got eaten by worms. Terrible way, alive. eaten alive by worms. I mean, going after you're dead, worms are fine, but not while you're alive, right? So they knew better, and they'd been given every chance to see, but they still wanted to oppose Christ. And doesn't that remind you of a verse that we quote here often? Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. In Romans 1:21. But that's the most thing. We hear it from Brother Richard all the time. The most important thing we can do in our lifetime is glorify God. And we all know it's true, but none of us do it enough. None of us. But anyway, all right, verse 24. The word, back to, yeah, there, thanks, Russell. The word of God grew and multiplied. So Christians are seeing the mighty hand of God within the early church, protecting the church, judging kings who stretch out their hand against the church, their little hands. Today we don't see it. Like I mentioned, we don't see it as much in real time. But at this critical time, it was God's will that he did do it in real time, right? Because the church needed to grow at this time. I was just reading the news this morning. Got a couple of minutes, maybe I'll discuss this. Syria just fell. The Assad regime just fell, and Assad fled. And there's some reports that his plane crashed on the way out of town, and that was 24 years, well, 50 some years of the Assad regime, because his father ran it before him. They were both dictators, elected. They're the only ones on the ballot, so they got elected. But 24 years he ruled there. In 2011, it's estimated that there were 2.2 million Christians in Syria, which is Antioch, which is what kind of the place we're talking about here. Although this account here happened in Tyre and Sidon, but and then before that we were talking about Jerusalem, where Peter was taken. But 2.2 million Christians in Syria in 2011, and today they're estimated at 677,000. Now a lot of them fled, but a lot of them were also killed during this Assad regime. But really, both Christians and Muslims are celebrating the end of the Assad regime. I don't expect that things are going to go better for either party with him gone. Not that he was any good, because he wasn't. But anyway, just talking about God's hand of justice. Sometimes it takes a while. That wicked man ruled there for 24 years. All right, back to where we were. Verse 25. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their ministry. What was their ministry again? Well, remember back in chapter 11, verses 29 and 30, we saw that they had taken a collection up at Antioch. It says, then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. And this they did, and they sent it by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So that was their ministry. That's why they were in Jerusalem. So now in verse 25 here, we see that they returned, Barnabas and Saul returned to Antioch. And they bring this young man, Mark, with them also. Now, this marks a division in the book of Acts. So up to now, it's been primarily Peter. We saw Stephen and Philip and some things with them, the two deacons. But the second half of this historical account of the early church is going to be dominated by Saul, and Barnabas. And so we're going to see that going forward. Peter sort of is in the background. And we're going to see also that the author, Luke, the author of the book of Acts, is a frequent traveling companion. So we're going to see him use terms showing that he was there with them. This is we, and we, those of us that were with him and he uses the term we. So we're going to see that he's with them. So some of these will be firsthand accounts going forward by the historian Luke. But anyway, hope everybody can join us in the back for some fellowship, and we can pick up where we left off before we started church this morning with all that great fellowship that we were hearing. Brother Cam?